Moby here on Think Globally Radio with his latest single called One Time We Lived. And Moby very active in keeping track of what's going on with climate change. I wonder if he'll actually be in Copenhagen himself. I wouldn't be surprised to see that little bald guy down there. And if I do, then I'm going to try to do an interview with him as well. I'd love to speak to him. He's actually I've interviewed him before many years ago, and we talked about a wide range of social issues back then for my music program, Rocket. But here on this show, I'd actually like to talk to Moby as well. Eric Paglia here tonight in the studio with the interview that I did with John McNeill, the environmental historian from Georgetown University. And I alluded to the fact that he's written a number of books, and I can recommend one, actually. Perhaps if you're going to read one book about the environment, just to sort of get you up to speed, to understand how we get into the situation we're in today, I would recommend one book, and that would be his book, Something New Under the Sun, an environmental history of the 20th century. Fantastic book, and it really gives you an idea of how humanity created the various environmental crises that you could say we face these days. But not just the crises, but also how we solved a lot of our environmental problems over the years through regulating pollution and other such things. But on a very different level these days with global warming because of the multilateral, multinational aspect of it, whereas pollution is usually more of a local issue, maybe a national issue that is much easier to resolve when it's under sort of one jurisdiction. But when you're dealing with a multilateral problem like climate change, as Professor McNeill has mentioned in this interview, it's a whole different story and much, much more difficult, as we're seeing in the lead up to Copenhagen, 1 month away. This past week, Barcelona was the place where a lot of the pre-negotiations were taking place. And I'm not sure how much progress they really made. As a matter of fact, I think it was maybe, I don't want to say that they went backwards by any means, but I think people are starting to maybe lower expectations a little bit for Copenhagen and starting to put the word out that maybe we won't have a final binding agreement in Copenhagen. Maybe we need another year or so to get things straightened out. But it's a process, and processes sometimes go on. And this one is maybe not going to be finished and resolved in Copenhagen, but maybe Copenhagen will actually set the stage for what will be maybe some sort of a binding agreement that will be finalized perhaps in a year or sometime in the not-too-distant future, hopefully. So Barcelona also, I was reading some articles about the water aspect. I guess the water community was really trying to get specific language about water and adaptation and water issues because a lot of climate change's impacts will play out through water. And I think the water community was a bit disappointed that there wasn't any real strong, direct wording when it comes to dealing with water issues that are going to be included in the negotiations text that will move forward to Copenhagen in 1 month. But let's get back now to the interview with Professor John McNeill, and we'll hear more about that. And also, I should mention that Dr. Charles Parker, a guest on the show a few weeks ago, an expert on these multilateral negotiations for climate change dealing, he was down there in Copenhagen with me, and he's the other voice you're hearing on this interview with Professor John McNeill. So Dr. Charles Parker asking some of the questions to John McNeill, and I'm asking some of the questions as well. So you can hear that coming up in part 2 of the interview here tonight on Think Globally with John McNeill, environmental historian.
You mentioned in your earlier remarks that you see the energy system, which recently has been dominated by fossil fuels, coal and oil, shifting over time. What in the near term and the long term would you see as this energy future going? What do you think it's going to look like, and to what extent do you think that this legislation will act as a driving force in making these transitions?
To the second part of that question first, I'd be, again, pleasantly surprised if upcoming legislation were genuinely a driving force towards changing the energy system. I think in the long run what will be required is further technological innovation that changes the price incentives to use this, that, or the other source of energy. But I'm cautiously optimistic that is happening. I know it's happening, and that it will continue to happen to the point where fossil fuels are much less dominant in the future than they have been in the recent past. Let me say a little bit more about this. At present, fossil fuels account for very close to 3/4 of the world's energy use, which is an all-time high. But I can imagine, well, I cannot foresee the details, and nobody can foresee the details, even though some people may believe they can, a future in which the energy mix is much more fragmented than it is now, and nothing accounts for 75% of energy use, but instead there'll be a more divided, a more fragmented energy mix in which wind power, solar power, tidal power, hydrogen, and a half dozen other things all account for larger shares than they do now, and fossil fuels will account for a smaller share in percentage terms. One of the big variables here is the future of nuclear power, extremely controversial. Many people whose judgment I admire and respect feel that for the next 50 years we have to turn to greater use of nuclear power to bridge between a fossil fuel energy regime and a future with a much larger role for renewables. I have not yet convinced myself of that, although I'm more open to that than I was 10 years ago. I still have major reservations about nuclear power, mainly connected to nuclear waste, for which there is as yet no satisfactory solution found anywhere in the world. So I'm still not convinced that that's a prudent investment, but I must say many people who are deeply engaged in the subject and very reasonable minds are convinced of that. The other last comment I'd like to make about this is I have spoken so far in percentage terms and how the energy mix is going to change. But one must also bear in mind the size of the energy system, that is the total volume of energy use, because what's important for climate change is the quantity of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally. And if energy use were to double and in percentage terms fossil fuel use to decrease by half, the situation would remain unchanged. So we have to pay close attention to the total size of the energy system as well as its composition.
You kind of anticipated one of my questions about the nuclear power. I was going to ask one follow-up on that. And it seems like you have reservations about expanding nuclear energy because of the waste problem, and I guess there's a technical problem and a political problem with that. But since nuclear power accounts to, I guess, some 16% of the energy mix today, then I would assume then it needs to at least maintain the role that it plays today in the energy mix, as opposed to those who want to see it phased out.
Well, that's controversial. A lot of the power plants around the world, there's over 400 of them now at work. A lot of them are 3 or 4 or 5 decades old, and as they age, they become more dangerous for reasons of physics. And so the risks of bad things happening to the older plants increase with time. The newer technologies are much, much better in terms of safety and also in terms of the efficiency. They need far less in the way of uranium to produce larger amounts of electricity. I am still not convinced that it's advisable to build the next generation of nuclear power plants, and if that is not done, then the older ones have to be decommissioned. They can't be kept going into their 60s and 70s. Their efficiency declines, their safety declines. Many of them are already too old, that is, they've outlived their anticipated lifespan. But that is what my inclination is. My expectation is the opposite.